Thank you. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Nilakantan. This is Rukmini, as you already know. So, the first question that I sort of wanted to begin with is that, as a man from Madras, I open the pages of the Hindu every morning. And during the time that the pandemic was raging, it would exasperate me no end because the way in which the basic COVID dashboard was presented was just like really bad data journalism / presentation of data, right? And somebody who does this for a living, I was annoyed for a long time, and they took almost a year to get it right. But to their credit, they did get it right in somewhere around 2021. So the reason I bring that up is that data journalism in this country primarily has, I would imagine, two antagonists, right? One is the markets, part of which is what results in what that presentation was, and the other is the data environment that we live in. And if I were to connect that sense of exasperation with having read Rukmini's book, I would imagine that and if I were to do this vulgar American idea of giving an elevator pitch of Rukmini's book, I would basically say that data in India is increasingly under attack from both these antagonists, and it's our duty as thinking citizens to shepherd it. So my question to Rukmini is, how does she look at that vulgar Americanization, and how does she sort of see both data journalism and the environment?
Thank you for that. Thank you for having me in this beautiful city. And as Nilakantan said, it's hard to look here and not look on that side. So I hope we can all enjoy the beach after this. I'm also particularly happy to be here because in the year that the book has been out, for various reasons, including the pandemic and rains, I have not been able to be in Kerala at all, and have not been able to meet readers from here. So I'm very happy to be here, and I look forward to speaking to more readers after the event as well. To come to your point, so as a data journalist, I for many years worked in Indian newsrooms, and only now have been independent for the last few years. And I have a lot of sympathy for the conditions under which most data journalists in India operate, which is they are seen almost, so even the people who report on something as important as the pandemic, the work is analogous to bringing out daily cricket statistics. That's essentially the way a lot of this work is viewed. That's the pace at which you're obliged to present work. That's the space you usually get for it. So I recognize the constraints under which journalists work, and I would also like to say that sometimes we have this great disdain for the mainstream media, but all of the sort of transformative things that we know that happened in the country over the last few years, we know about it because of the reporting of the mainstream media, including key questions around the pandemic. So I suppose I'm more inclined to forgive those sins of data presentation and admire the Hindu for what it did, for example, on estimating COVID mortality. I mean, that is a true national service, that is the true job of the media, and that is a job that the media continues to perform, the mainstream media continues to perform very well in India. So I think when there's this broad sort of skepticism and frustration with the mainstream media, we're forgetting the details, and the detail here is that the Indian media acquitted itself exceptionally well in the pandemic in bringing out the story of excess deaths. This included work by journalists in non-English newsrooms across the country, where the pressures are much greater, resources are much tighter, risks are so much greater. It's so much easier for me sitting in a well-funded English newsroom in a big city to report on excess mortality without significant risk, as compared to a journalist writing for a Gujarati language newspaper in a small town in Gujarat, who did the hard work of going to crematoria, going to hospitals, counting ambulances, and putting together those fundamental numbers around COVID mortality that allowed us to build this picture that then others, including the WHO, have been able to build upon. So to me, pandemic coverage in the last 2 years has been a reassuring reminder of the resilience and the continuing importance of the mainstream media in Indian public life. I would say I would disagree partly with you on the characterization of the book, only because I feel that I come from a place of great hope. So I come from a place of hope for two reasons. One is, I think many of us fail to fully appreciate how impressive India's original statistical architecture is. And the reason it is that way has a lot to do with the moment of the founding moment, the sort of decolonizing thinking behind which even India's statistical architecture was set up. Our founding fathers in this case, but not always, thought of statistics as essential for planning, and that this was in essence a nationalistic thing to do, when nationalism didn't mean being violently opposed to people with viewpoints other than yours. So I find it impressive and sort of moving to think about the architecture that was put in place when we were a country that was so poor and underdeveloped that we had no right really to be thinking of putting in place a household survey system that no one in the world was doing right then. There's a good reason that politicians from across the world, including China, visited India to see, to try and understand how this country was putting the structure in place. So that's there, and I remain impressed by the scale of the data that we do collect, as well as new private initiatives that I admire. Just the fact that they are private doesn't mean that that's necessarily wrong. That's what they were put in place for. And I admire the great public-spirited work that people in the open data field are doing. However, admiring what we've put in place doesn't mean that that we can rest on our laurels. And in fact, I think by doing that for many years, we've allowed a state of decay to creep into our statistical systems, and we are all suffering for it now. So it was incumbent on us to be playing a better watchdog role in the last 10 years, when many were warning that India's statistical system was just not keeping up. It hadn't grown fast enough, it wasn't nimble enough, it wasn't digitized enough, there weren't enough full-time people working there. And most importantly, as Mr. Mohanan has pointed out, we did not develop an independent oversight commission with strong legal backing, which is something we should all have been pushing for a long time. I mean, we should in some ways, people like you and I who feel, say, angry or outraged now, we should be kicking ourselves over not having read enough and being aware enough 5 or 6 or 10 years ago, and not having made enough noise for having an independent statistical commission. So I'd say I have a lot of sort of optimism about what was built and continuing faith in what can be built. Of course, there are huge forces buffeting the data journalism and the sort of overall environment of data right now, and it's incumbent on all of us to do something about it.
So coming to the book itself, I must say that when I was reading your book, I was reminded of one of my favorite books, which is Birth of a Theorem by Cedric Villani, the French mathematician who went on to win the Fields Medal. The reason is that he seamlessly weaves between what is his Fields Medal winning work and the personal story of arriving at that, hence the name Birth of a Theorem, right? Like that work. And much of that book, is essentially, non-linear lambda dampening, which more than 50% of which I didn't understand. But the point is that he had a wonderful way of moving between the personal story of arriving at his work and the work itself, right? In the first part where anybody with a sort of college education can follow the mathematics. So I thought the personal story was like, why is he doing this? Let's just, focus on the mathematics. And then, that is akin to, I don't know, when you're watching a tennis match, when Stan Wawrinka hits like a backhand down the line, you don't need the commentator to tell you how sublime that was. You can watch it, right? But as the book progressed, and
I think you're missing a trick here by not going with a football analogy for this setting.
but anyway, so yes, I don't watch football, unfortunately. So as the book progressed, and the mathematics became harder, and I did not follow it. I sort of craved for the personal story of his, right? Like, how do I say this? Like, what we don't understand is pedantry in some ways. And I read your book, and it sort of, to me, seemed like you're doing something of what he does, but in an entirely different context, which is that you move between the actual data, and suddenly it's reportage, you talk to the people involved, you humanize the data, so on and so forth. So the question that I have for you is, like, how much of your journalist training came into that? Do you see that as a literary device, or is that a natural way in which you approach it? Do you see your job as analysis or reportage, or how did you do that?
So I think part of the reason why my writing reads as written for the layperson is because I am a layperson. I have no training in math, stats, politics, economics, anything particularly useful. So the way I arrive at an understanding is by very slowly reading through what I'm looking at and talking to people for where I don't understand, simply asking where I don't understand. And the good thing about being a journalist is that figuring out information in this way is supposed to be your job. You're not expected to be fully conversant in what you're writing about, but you are expected to read up on it and ask questions. So in that way, being a journalist gave me great training for this. And I think the way I'm able to arrive at some sort of understanding by slowly piecing through information helps, because that's how most of the people I'm talking to are sort of arriving at an understanding, by slowly sort of figuring and working through this information. The question of stories has always been a bit fraught to me, and it's actually, I find it quite difficult to decide how much of data and how much of storytelling to put into a piece. And the reason for this is because my personal affinity is actually to stick to the data. Now, there's a very standard way in which you'll read data journalism anywhere in the world, including in the New York Times, which is you open with a story, and then in the second or third paragraph, they zoom out, and you understand why that person or how that person fits in. Okay, it could be this person is, in the bottom 5% of the country, or you zoom out over there. I find that such a tiresome trope that when I start reading it that way, I immediately get put off. And when I speak to journalism students, I tell them, don't feel that you have to stick to these sorts of, set patterns. Figure out your own way of telling a story. Maybe you don't want to tell a story at all. You want to lead with the number and be confident enough that if you tell the story clearly, you're explaining a number clearly, people will understand. You don't have to do stories there. That said, I do know that what stays with people the most is stories. People sometimes remark upon being amazed by some data point in the book, for sure. But the thing that sticks with people is stories. And I see this in myself. I love hearing people tell stories as well. I see this in children. I see this in older people, this sort of great love for stories. So I think combining the two without being too manipulative about it is really the key to how I try to do this. I try very hard to make sure that I'm not telling myself, okay, I've been talking about data for 500 words now, I need to put a story in there, because people can see through that sort of manipulative way. That said, I still struggle with this, because what you are doing when you are telling a story is you are picking one person's story to tell. What does it say about all of the people you've not picked in this? What does it mean if you pick, for example, an outlier story to tell in here? So in the book, for example, in one chapter, the whole chapter is about attitudes to food, love, and marriage. And I spend many, many pages and many, many words talking about how rare intercaste marriage is in India. It's under 3%, it's extremely rare. Study after study, survey after survey has shown this. And then right at the end of the chapter, I talk to a young man who's in an intercaste relationship himself. And I tell him, these numbers, do they make you feel lonely? Do they make you feel like an outlier? And he says, no, they don't, because your numbers are about marriage. They are not about love. And he says, in India, many people would find it hard to take that final leap of turning their backs on families to enter into an intercaste or interreligious marriage. But believe me, he said, there are lots of my friends who are in intercaste relationships. So in a sense, that undid all of my work. That undid all of those neat statistics. What am I doing by spending a whole chapter saying intercaste marriage is very rare, but maybe intercaste relationships are common, who knows. But I don't mind that. I think complicating numbers is important because sometimes numbers give certainty to an India that is not simple and is not flattened. So I'm lucky that I'm in a position where I don't have to give answers. I can keep asking questions, and I enjoy using stories to actually not tell the average or the median, but to pick outliers to complicate numbers.
Interesting. Can you go on and talk a little bit about your stories, for instance, on food habits or on COVID deaths? Because I just thought, like you rightly said, they are not the median stories, but they clarified quite a bit in terms of what is not the norm, right? Like, could you sort of expand on that?
Yeah. So, for example, we have ample data on vegetarianism and the fact that it is a minority sort of a state of being in India. The median Indian, the majority way of being, the most common way of being in India is not vegetarianism. We know that a lot through the data now. But then I have a story in the book, for example, with a young woman who says that while she grew up eating meat, she feels that now if a surveyor was to come to talk to her mother or grandmother, they would not admit to eating meat. So there, for example, to me is a good idea of going back to think about, are we underestimating meat consumption, even though it is far over 50%, are we underestimating it? Then additionally, when people say that, caste discrimination has vanished from urban India, in MNC offices, nobody asks each other their caste. I have the story of a young SC man who says that, the most common thing, so many of us will have seen this, that in an office kitchen, the microwave has a sign on it saying no heating non-vegetarian food here. And he said to me, that's caste discrimination, that's discrimination. He says, when my ex-girlfriend's father said to her, you can marry whoever you want, but no Muslims and scheduled caste. That's caste discrimination. We see that in matrimonials, for example, whether it's coded in terms of skin color and meat preferences or in more direct ways. So, yes, stories sometimes sort of add color to and give nuance to what numbers show. And then in cases like my young man in an intercaste relationship, stories sometimes undo what neat statistics do.
So, building on that, right? Like there are a couple of chapters. One on how India earns, and another on how India spends. You should all, make your respective uncles read that, because it's a primer for uncles, basically. The questions that I had for you after I read that was, there's an extended discussion on what is class and what is middle class. When I was reading that, the thing that went through my head was, do you remember when we were children, there was this BBC satirical show where they had an upper class man who was just holding on to his drink, had no money, but was upper class and was holding on to it, right? Did you kind of have that in mind when you wrote that, to debunk the class income? So it's a complicated question, right? Class does not mean middle income, but we quite often sort of treat them as synonyms, and you have an extended discussion on that. Can you go on?
What I was trying to debunk or sort of push back against is this sense of victimhood that is rife among the rich who call themselves the middle class. And as a journalist who worked in newsrooms, the time of year this used to annoy me the most was at budget time. Because then you'd see all these headlines saying, why is there nothing for the middle class here? And every year I would just wish I could write something saying, you are not the middle class. The person you are talking about is not the middle class. So for example, just to put this in perspective, in 2017-18, if you spent more than 8,500 rupees a month as an individual, you were in the top 5% of urban India. That's what Indian statistics show. So the people who are whining about the lack of tax benefits for the middle class are most certainly not talking about the middle class. So I think it came from the desire to sort of push back against that sense of victimhood. It also comes as only 3% of Indians pay tax. What do us taxpayers get? Well, first of all, that's not true. Every single Indian, and particularly the poorest, face a disproportionate burden because of indirect taxes. So everybody pays taxes. And the reason that only the top 3% are paying income taxes because everybody else is too poor to pay income tax. I mean, it baffles me that can lead anyone to a sense of victimhood. It should lead you to a sense of huge empathy towards your fellow citizens, that you are at least rich enough to be able to pay income tax. So I suppose that was the sense, and particularly from having worked in Indian newsrooms where this was a trope, schemes for the poor, what about the middle class? That was the frustration that I was trying to push back against.
Right, but on those two specific chapters particularly, that is the one on earning and the other on spending, more seriously, the GDP back series, I don't know how many of you are still angry about the GDP back series that the government of India put out like a few years ago. It's now 6 years now? This is five years, right? All of you would have written some version of an exam in maths in high school, right? Where you were asked to prove a theorem. And because the beginning, you start writing something, then you don't know how to proceed. And because it's a theorem, you know what the end is. So you write the QED and you start moving backwards. And the teacher circles like the middle. 2011 GDP data that the government of India put out was that red circle, right? It made absolutely no sense, right? And, Mr. P.C. Mohanan, who's here, partly quit because of that, right? And I would imagine that was one of India's darkest moments. And I don't know why, but he is not as angry about it as I am still about it. But do you want to expand on that?
Sure. So, first to address the question of anger, I think, if you, and I'm not going to speak for Mr. Mohanan, but the most important thing to me, being constructive is what I would like to focus most energies on. And if you see any of Mr. Mohanan's interviews in the aftermath of that, it was always talking about what we needed to do, which is that we needed to strengthen the National Statistical Commission. And similarly to people who feel angry, I would encourage that sentiment of taking something that happened, understanding why it happened, and thinking about how to make it better. We are all sort of invested in making sure these things don't happen again. So what should we do to make sure it doesn't happen again? Let's think about how we can build momentum around an independent statistical commission on the lines that other countries do have. Can we make it an issue on which there's broad public consensus? Can we make it a political issue? Can we encourage more politicians to put their weight behind it? Should there be questions in Parliament around it? So there's clear work to do on that. I think with the GDP back series that happened, there's a couple of sort of key points over there. One is that when you do have a system that's existed for a long time and with checks and balances about how data is put out, and that is bypassed, then that becomes something to point out, as journalists did, and that becomes again something to direct energies at how to fix. So having systems and bypassing them was a big problem there. Then not being clear and public enough about methodology is a big problem, and is really something that applies more broadly. And this is something again where I want to encourage more people to pay attention. It's difficult to do because when you usually read from the GDP to anything else, when you read about numbers in the newspaper, you have no idea how they were collected, right? Most journalists are going to say, my job is to say that this is what growth rates are, this is what inflation is. I'm not going to spend 1,000 words telling you what the methodology is. Now there's no excuse for that anymore. Space is not limited. There's no excuse for not explaining methodology anymore. And honestly, I believe two things. One is I believe a lot of journalists writing do not actually understand the methodology themselves, which is why it becomes hard to understand. And we, the readers, feel that we are dumb or don't understand math or statistics, and this is why we can't understand numbers. While the fact is, I think, that it's so poorly explained because it's so poorly understood. And that's why we are not able to understand, not because, maths is that hard to understand, or at least at the level at which we're talking about. So more journalists and more people need to do a better job of explaining methodology. We need to making methodology public and well discussed an essential part of this. So one of the sort of essential things that a journalist from Mint, Pramit Bhattacharya, did around the reporting around the GDP was that he went back and showed the stuffing, what goes into these numbers. He went back and showed the database of companies that was used and some of the issues around it. How rarely that happens, right? How rarely we know what goes into it. Even inflation, we don't, if you ask me right now, I wouldn't be able to tell you the list of items that are in the basket that makes up inflation. And that basket, you would imagine, needs to change, right? If we still have, say, Walkmans and cassette players in the basket, that's a problem. Those things need to be updated. So we need to do a much better job of explaining what goes on behind numbers. We need to think about checks and balances, and we need to have a much broader public conversation around this.
And one of my pet peeves around this is particularly that, right? Like, which is the time that most lay people come across any of this is around elections, when there is either opinion polling or exit polling, on which you have an entire chapter. And it blows my mind that like almost no newspaper or media sort of channel gives out their methodology, and they just give out results. Anybody with a high school education can understand that what we need is more and more polling. It doesn't matter if the polling is wrong. What you need is that you need a chronological series of polls, so that even if the methodology is wrong and they make that out in public, you can at least measure the direction in which things are moving, right? Like the famous saying goes for all data science practitioners, all models are wrong and some are useful, right? And that is true for polling as well. All polls are wrong, some are useful, right? And especially those that are wrong are particularly useful because you can sort of benchmark that against what the eventual outcomes were. And that's the reason why exit polls exist, right? Like, so that why people said what they said and what the actual outcomes are, and sort of compare with that. And as a, do I call you a former journalist? Journalist? Like there isn't a series of polling like in chronological order, either on electoral issues or on social attitudes towards other things. And in the absence of such data environment, like it almost becomes like what you call, I forget the phrase you use in the book, for sort of journalists dropping into a random place and sort of talking to parachuting, right? Like, and four people and sort of, passing that off as the truth about the upcoming elections, right? In the absence of chronological polling, what options do they have, right?
So this is really a case of having terrible incentives. The way we've structured opinion polling in India is that the media commissions it just before elections. Now, there's a terrible set of words following each other in one sentence, right? Designed for bad outcomes. Nowhere in the world is a broad I won't say nowhere in the world. In the democracies that I look at, I wouldn't know of one where a broad understanding of the relationship between citizens and political parties is based on opinion polling commissioned by TV channels in completely opaque fashion. So that's a problem starting from there. And the TV channels are not interested in understanding this relationship between people and the state. They're interested in like a betting market equivalent of understanding who's going to win the election.
Can I just add something there for context? I don't know how many of you follow this. I don't want to name the channel here, but from one poll to the next, which was about 3 to 6 months away, if I'm not wrong, around the 2019 elections, they had a volatility of 33%, and they didn't care to explain that.
Yes, so really what they're interested in is that single number. I would say not even two numbers, not even seats and vote share. They only want the seat number. That's what they're doing it for. And here's the thing, my feeling is, fine, that's what they want to do, but we can't rely on that to try and understand the country. So the one sort of time series of detailed opinion polling that we have is through CSDS, the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, based out of Delhi, and that is run in a charitable fashion. We need much more of this if we feel we want to understand it. We've seen a little of it from coming out of US universities. We need to see it coming out of Indian universities as well. So that incentive structure is completely messed up. But we in the media have some responsibilities which we have failed on. So I think that journalists need to come together to form some sort of compact where we agree that if a pollster does not tell us the source of funding, if the channel does not, or we don't know clearly who has commissioned it, we don't know details like the sample size, methodology, basic details like that, we will refuse to cover it. There have been instances in the past where Indian media organizations have come together and formed compacts around some issues. I strongly believe we need to do this around elections as well. But what happens is an election comes around the corner and all of the media collectively loses its mind and sees 8 different shiny numbers and wants to take all of them. And then, the worst of it all, call it poll of polls, which is average it all out and hope for the best. So all of these seem like the ingredients for a truly terrible number, and that's what's happening now. And I would say even the ones who do conduct more detailed opinion polls, in my view, are not asking the right questions. And social scientists in India, by continuing to rely on those questions, have formed theories about how the Indian voter operates that, in my view, are not borne out by reality and are not supported by good numbers. So, for example, one question that's asked at the beginning and end pretty much of every pre-election opinion poll is, what is the top issue on your mind? And for every election since the dawn of India, the top answer is always unemployment, the economy, jobs. And if that was the case, it's pretty hard to explain how the incumbent was re-elected in 2019 at the time at which there was a historic high in unemployment. But that question never sort of gets asked later. Or what happened in 2014, which is people said that they wanted to vote on the economy. Then the incumbent changed. And then after the election, when they were asked, how is your economic situation? Most said it was better than it had been 5 years ago. So we have to see these gaps in the numbers and not take them at face value. And simultaneously, when people say, for example, in opinion polling that 45% said that they would want an MP from their caste in their constituency, you have to see these intersections, and we cannot see them as single answers that satisfy the sort of notion of the sort of ideal voter that we ourselves would like to believe in.
The next time polls come about, my advice to you is sort of skip them, right? But anyway, the building on that unemployment.
No, I would just say I wouldn't skip them, because that would mean that then you rely on political journalism, which in my view is just as bad. People say that polls get it wrong, polls are done so badly, let's not look at opinion polls. Well, political journalism is in shambles as well. And one of the reasons,
that was the second point. First is skip political journalism, right? Anyway, so the building on that unemployment, data that you pointed to, I don't know how many people here are aware of what is. So India produces about, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 2 and 3 million jobs per year, right? Like in the organized sector, that is. So let's assume it's 2.5 million. India also produces about 12.5 million college-educated people every year. That is 12.5 million college-educated people join the workforce, right? And then there are 4 times as many people who did not go to college who become eligible to join the workforce, right? Because they never went to college. With such high numbers of unemployment in any other society, these make the French Revolution look tame, right? Except nobody seems to be talking about it, and this comes at a time when we've had serious issues around the way in which we measure unemployment. Replacing we now have what is the PLFS, but some version of it the data was not released in 2019. So do you want to expand on that?
Sure. So what happened with the unemployment data in 2017-18 is that it showed a historic high in unemployment, and then those numbers were held back and released after the election. So, it's a bad news, good news story. The bad news is the numbers were held back. The good news is they were released after the election. The bad news is the numbers showed a 45-year high in unemployment. Of course, we should talk also about the fact that unemployment alone, that single number, often doesn't do a good enough job of capturing the distress that people experience even within the workforce. Most people do have to work in some form, and this can often lead to having to work in low quality, poor wage, degrading jobs because you need a job to sort of get by and feed your family. So thinking beyond unemployment as a number alone is important. I think what happened with the PLFS is the periodic labor force survey. The thinking was good, which is that we needed to measure unemployment or employment more frequently. We couldn't do it just once a year and then it comes out 2 years later in PDF form. We needed to do it more frequently, so they moved to a quarterly system. That shift took a while, didn't happen fast enough, and those quarterly numbers too don't come out immediately. But I would say it's not a bad news story here. We have got a little quicker in measuring employment through the PLFS. Simultaneously, what's happened, and this really sort of poses big questions for the data ecosystem in India, to which I don't really have answers. You might have thoughts as well, given your work, which is we have an entirely parallel private system now of measuring employment through the Center for the Monitoring of the Indian Economy, which produces high frequency numbers from a panel which is now the world's largest household panel survey. This data is expensive, it's privately collected, it's available to people who pay 25 lakh per year, which is typically your large companies. None of this makes it bad. They've built it as a private good and there's people willing to pay for it. But what does it mean for a democracy when one of your core numbers is one that's being best captured by a system that's closed and private and behind a paywall? So most researchers as well, in addition to companies, now use this data. You'll see lots of social science research using it. Of course, they cannot make this data publicly available. And it brings me to a sort of larger point, which is that we have so much innovation going around in India that we can imagine a situation in which individuals and the private sector are bootstrapping their way to all sorts of data that's either not available through government or taking too long or difficult to access. But it poses important questions for democracy. If we are satisfied with numbers that come from the private sector or bootstrapped by public-spirited individuals, are we lowering the pressure on a democratically elected government to provide data that is rightfully ours? Now, not everybody can stand around, with their hands on their hips waiting for the revolution to come. So in the interim, this is what we're all doing. But I do think it poses difficult questions for a democracy when key questions are answered through data that is no longer available to the public.
So, combining this and the previous question, right? One of the questions that I've sort of had in my head for a very long time is, why don't we have something like what the Rand Corporation does in the US, right? Like, I agree with you that, one of the reasons why we don't have periodic, let's say, opinion polling or polling around elections is because it's very expensive. There is sampling bias, there is response bias, there are an awful lot of, problems associated with it. Rand Corporation sort of had an interesting experiment wherein they basically said, we will have this randomly chosen sample, but we will periodically poll them over time, right? So remember, like what we discussed like a while ago, like what we want is the direction of movement, not the absolute number, right? And if you have already chosen a sample, regardless of how right or wrong it is, with this particular sample, you can still measure directional movement, and it is a lot less expensive because it's the same sample every time. I've sort of wondered, why don't people do that in India, given that this is probably the country where this is, it's most suited for, right? The reason why they did that in the US is because they were worried about response bias of Trump voters, right? We have a whole slew of other complicating factors towards response bias. So, like, do you have a question? Why don't media organizations do this?
So I think the level of resources that it needs is not something that media organizations are willing to spend money on. We do have some of this, so with CSDS, for example, for opinion polling, and then for, sort of more occasionally done, we have the India Human Development Survey, for example, which is done, but it still takes them 5 or 6 years to process all of their data and put it out, and they too have had a 10-year gap in conducting it as well. I would also say that the National Sample Survey does a lot of this, and it asks questions that we don't usually even expect would come from government. So the best source of data that we have on why people travel, how many people go on holiday, how many people take flights, doesn't actually come from industry bodies, which do a poor job of sampling people, and actually still comes from the National Sample Survey. So yes, I think there is scope for more public-spirited sort of organizations to come together to do more of this, but the challenges are significant as well. I think one of the things that people are considering now is that given the advent of phones, this could lower costs substantially. We still don't have a good enough model of a well-done phone survey. And of course, there are biases. Women are less likely to have access to phones. But this could provide a direction for the future as well.
Yeah, because the most commonly cited reason for such surveys to fail in developed countries is a response bias when people call. But this is a country where people share OTPs over phone. So I'm like, why wouldn't they share their political opinion, right? Anyway, so before we proceed, do you want to
Please don't share OTPs over the phone.
Do you want to lay out for the audience and for whoever might watch this video in the future as to what the various data sources are, right? Like for anybody who wants to sort of look into this, because I think a lot of young people who know a little bit of Python coding will find the sources very, very rich to do any and all just play things that might do.
So from within the government system, you have sort of the top of the pops. One is the census, which feels like an odd thing to say right now, given that we've not had one in 12 years, but it'll come someday. The National Sample Survey, which is again conducted in rounds that happen quite frequently and depending on needs along different issues. We have the impressive National Family Health Survey that is conducted every 5 years or so, for which we rely on all our data around health questions, but also some other questions. And all of these are in line with international codes and classifications. So the NFHS, for example, is conducted in line with the demographic and health surveys that are done across the world. So there's relatively, a good reason to have some faith in them. Faith may be the wrong word here. Then what we also have is a whole lot of administrative data. We have data from various government schemes. We also have data that is specifically along demographic issues from the sample registration system and the civil registration system that are again under the Home Ministry. So there's all of this government architecture. Then when it comes to crimes, we have the National Crime Records Bureau, which has its own problems, but it's there. Then the key big large private surveys that we look at, one is the India Human Development Survey that's currently going on the field in its third round, conducted jointly by the National Council for Applied Economic Research and the University of Maryland. They always put all of their data in public and it's freely available. Additionally, we have the Center for the Monitoring of the Indian Economy that conducts what's called the Consumer Pyramid Household Survey and another survey. While all of it is not in public, the director of the CMIE puts unemployment data in the public sphere every week in an article he writes for Business Standard. Additionally, what we have now are some sort of, some of these open data efforts that rely on scraping data that exists from, sometimes from government or other sources and putting them in the public sphere. So one example is that India has a, now well-developed e-courts system, but there's no data as such that comes from it, but there's people scraping it and producing data sets from it. A lot of this work happens around a community that I would like to encourage people to join called Data Meet. It is a Google group that's been in existence for 10 plus years right now and is dedicated to making data open, free, widely available to people. So yeah, this is the sort of broad architecture of Indian data.
Before I open to the audience, is there a place where, this is listed, or you should consider having that? Because I'll tell you what, anybody who, I don't know, I'm sure there are students here who are looking to do some college project or something, like if even 5% of them take this up and sort of, somebody develops a little bit of Python utility for scraping old PDF files to sort of put them in some version of a searchable table, public policy research would dramatically improve in this country.
Yeah, so there's only so much I can talk about it right now, but I'd just like to say that this is something that me and others are working on for the near future, and hopefully I'll have something to share later this year.
Right, thank you. Audience, yes. Gentleman behind you had his first. Yes, the one in the red cap. Yes, sorry, we'll come to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you, you both. Now, Rukmini, you challenged us to think about story and data together. So it is in that spirit, I would like to bring your attention if there is something called narrative ethics. And we can also talk about narrative mathematics and narrative statistics. But it also requires a different methodology. So how do we design a methodology which is more prone to narrative listening? This is my first query. Second, also there is ethical challenge involved. You have hinted at that, but I would request you to face more directly the whole ethical and aesthetic challenges. In development studies, we are familiar with development ethical challenges. Since there is now a lot of connection between data and development, how do we place this challenge that you are putting in the context of development ethics and development aesthetics?
Okay, so
I'm going to pass the first question to Nilakantan because I don't know about it.
Okay, so we need to first have a proper data environment wherein we get all the factors which are easily accessible, and for us to do everything that there is, assuming that it is a normal distribution, to then arrive at what is narrative mathematics, right? We'll cross that bridge when it comes, but we are hardly there, and therefore it sort of makes it difficult given the data environment that we inhabit to do that. That is not to stop us from going there, but I would argue that, we haven't, I don't know, at least in India, the amount of gaps that exist in the existing methodology is so vast that it worries me if we make that jump. I haven't had well-formed thoughts on that yet, but let me think about it. Maybe we'll have a chat afterwards.
And on the question of ethics, I'm not sure I'm directly answering your question, but just some broad thoughts around it. Yes, I think sometimes what happens is that there is a temptation to use data and sort of, because we live in a relatively data poor environment, to use what there is without considering these questions too deeply. So for example, I had my worldview really shaken by a book that was written by two researchers from Azim Premji University around Nagaland and around the sort of systematic errors in India's official statistics on the state of Nagaland, right from the census to the National Sample Survey. I think what often happens is that you see these as almost as an asterisk or as italics, and you feel, sure, the data is not representative for smaller states and just ignore it. But when you think about, when you are told about all of the sort of issues that have gone on behind collecting the data in remote regions and in border states in particular, it should give us pause about using numbers without asking these questions. Additionally, I think there are substantial ethical issues around the collection of data, and we are going to encounter them more closely going forward as contestations around issues like citizenship take a, the turn that they have. So thinking around what it would mean for a person to admit to being a migrant in a border state whenever the census is conducted, and whether it is even morally right of us to expect that answer from them, is a complicated issue. So the sort of, in a way, I mean, I don't like to use this much, but the sort of almost violence that is part of the very process of conducting these surveys is something to think about. Questions around privacy and ethics in data collection are enormous. We've seen this. We've seen challenges faced in the state of Telangana, for example, where we have seen this linking, non-consensual linking of Aadhaar and voter ID information. So there's a range of issues around data collection, ethics in data collection that certainly come up that need us to consider them without, sort of plowing on without considering the.
Can I just add one more thing? When governments have tried to collect data about citizens since the time of Alexander the Great, right? And it is always in search for greater power or expansion of territory. It's like people like me happen to have a job because that data exists, but that data is always collected for problematic reasons, and we have to make our, I don't want to say we want to make our peace with that, but well, it is what it is. The gentleman, actually, there's a gentleman there and then here. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry, sir.
Okay. So often data related to economic indicators are often manipulated before presenting. So how can we guard against believing into this? Like, is there a way out of it?
No, thank you for that question, because I get asked a version of this often, especially by younger people, and I feel like it's important to talk about this. I would like to suggest that we enter into our inquiry with numbers with skepticism rather than suspicion. And I think what happens sometimes is that if we don't look at the details too closely, we become broadly suspicious of everything, and we assume that all data is so deeply manipulated as to be unusable. And then we throw our hands up and say that all of this data is useless, we can't do anything with it, let's not pay any attention to it. So I've had so many young people tell me that they've not been looking at data or tuning it out because they believe it's all fake and manipulated. Now, I think it's extremely important to pay attention to the people who are pointing out issues with the data and pay very close attention to what those issues are. So, for example, with the GDP series that Nilakantan mentioned, the argument is not that someone sat somewhere and fudged all those numbers and these are all wrong or fake. Similarly, with the employment numbers or consumption numbers, there are very specific issues which usually have to do with changes in methodology. Now, all of this is boring and hard work, but it's important because if we become very broadly suspicious of this all, we miss the wood for the trees. We think that it's all fake and manipulated, while the problems tend to much more often be with specific issues around methodology. So what you can do in that case is sometimes say, okay, then we can use this indicator only for this. Or we should not use this indicator for this year because there were these issues. This stuff is very well understood and documented and talked about. There is a rich community of Indian economists, statisticians and others who write widely in the public sphere write in published journals, we should pay attention to them and focus on those very specific issues. So to feel that all economic data is manipulated before it comes into the public sphere, and so how do we know what to trust, is in my view neither borne out by reality nor helpful. So my advice is to pay very close attention to errors, because there will be people like Mr. Mohanan and other journalists from across the country who will point it out, and then we can work with that data. It's not unusable, and it's not all manipulated, and it's not all Banana Republic territory.
Can I just add here? As a young person, whenever data comes out, I think all of you should basically, apply basic statistical tests to all data that comes out in public domain. A, it's interesting in its own self. B, it sort of, if you do find errors, it adds to the public discourse. And C, you might end up with a project. So, yes.
Yeah. In a world that's increasingly defined by data, how important is it that the media is data literate? For example, even if you take a sphere like sports, which is very data heavy, a lot of people who write and commentate on it are completely data illiterate. So how important is it going forward that those who work in the media are data literate?
Thank you for that. So I want to start with the acknowledgement that data literacy is a function of many privileges, including access to resources and access to knowledge that is not equally shared across the country. So the reason that you will see much more data journalism in English newsrooms is because they are much better funded and able to hire people who come sometimes with a data science background, not even a journalism background, while this cannot, and then they can build teams. While this is not the case often for non-English newsrooms that operate with much fewer resources. So in my view, it is incumbent on, well, not incumbent, but I believe that journalists who have been able to gain access to some data knowledge should be sharing their knowledge with journalists from non-English newsrooms across the country, where the ability to do truly transformative things with data, as we have seen in the pandemic, is so much stronger than in Delhi, where there's an abundance of data anyway. So there are big initiatives from across the world that are trying to do this. The Google News initiative is one that invests in non-English newsrooms and attempts to bring, for people who are interested in it, bring data journalism there, as well as journalists who are happy to share this information, conduct training programs for those in other newsrooms as well. I think a data journalist is an asset to every newsroom, and having a few on staff is vital for all sorts of coverage, from politics to sports to other issues. That said, I do not want to make it seem as if data journalism is the only way to arrive at deep truths. Some of the most transformative work that we know about what happened in the country happened without any data knowledge. So if you look at the pandemic, for example, people who were able to figure out that all deaths were not being counted in their own small town, for example, did it with good old-fashioned shoe leather reporting of landing up in hospitals and in crematoria and counting and looking at registers and building sources. Then data journalists can build on that to come up with what numbers could look like for the state, or give context, do more of that. But it's one tool in the sort of box that's available to journalists, and by no means should it be the only one.
Right. I've been told that we will not have time to take any further questions. I'm sure Rukmini will be happy to answer anything on stage. Yeah. All right. And are you signing books?
Yes, I'm happy to talk to people and
Please
sign books.
buy the book.
Thank you.
Thank you, people.